Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, October 3rd, 2019. I've got a lot of chatter about impeachment coming up in the second half of the podcast today. But this week marks 2 years since 58 people were slaughtered by a gunman at the Mandalay Bay casino in Las Vegas. And news surfaces today that there is a settlement that's very close to being reached, valued at $800 million. And this is a turnabout because MGM had declared itself free of any liability using a little-known federal law that was passed after 9/11, and they were trying to avoid any financial responsibility for the killings that were conducted by a man named Stephen Paddock. But they have reversed that position, and I'm glad to see that the survivors and victims' families will receive some compensation. Now, Las Vegas is also the scene of a Democratic gathering where the candidates for president discuss their respective gun positions. And I'm not going to take time to run down every candidate, but I want to focus on a couple of them. Beto O'Rourke has taken the most extreme position, saying that he would support mandatory buyback of assault weapons. And I'm sympathetic to that position, but I think that it is practically impractical. It simply doesn't work. And I think that politically it sends a message to the paranoid owners of guns in America that Democrats are coming for their weapons. And this was a long-running false meme that was launched during the Obama administration. He didn't make any effort to pick up anybody's guns. And so, as a pragmatist, my view is that what Beto is calling for is courageous on his part. But it's also politically a non-starter. It simply, I don't believe, will move forward. Now, some people can, criticize me for failing to promote an ideal. But we have hundreds of millions of guns already in circulation in this country. And the idea that we are going to be able to reduce that inventory through mandatory buybacks, well, I simply don't think that is rational. So, in an unusual approach, the chief editor of BuzzFeed, his name is Smith. What is his name here? Smith. He, maybe Ben. He interviewed Beto O'Rourke via text. And he said, are you worried about polls and listening to consultants related to gun buybacks? Beto says, to those in our party worried about polls, listening to consultants, and I'm thinking about Mayor Pete, let me tell you that assault weapons buybacks are supported by a majority of Americans. Not only is this the right thing to do, the American people are with us on this. Now, there are some polls that show that more than half of Americans do support it. Beto goes on. They should be worried that their poll testing, triangulating politics is irrelevant when it comes to how people feel about guns and about protecting the lives of their kids and families. The NRA, the consultants, the people more worried about their re-election have set the terms for this debate for too long. And asked, do you find Pete particularly calculating on this issue? He says yes. His comment about the shiny object today was so offensive to anyone who's been shot by one of these weapons or who fears being shot or who has lost someone to an AR-15 or AK-47. It is offensive to these courageous leaders in March for Our Lives. It's the kind of poll-driven, consultant-driven politics that has prevented progress on this issue in the past. So again, I respect this courageous stand that is politically somewhat suicidal on the part of Beto O'Rourke. And despite the fact that many people know about his position, it has not improved his standing in the polls. Meanwhile, Joe Biden offered a pretty moderate gun plan in advance of the confab in Las Vegas last night. And he calls for universal background checks, an assault weapons ban on new manufacture of those weapons, more resources for the enforcement of existing laws, a public push for the development of smart guns, and incentives for states to adopt red flag laws. Now, he also has a voluntary buyback program through which assault weapon owners can sell their guns, and if they don't want to do that, they have to go through a background check and register the weapons, like they are forced to do with machine guns today. Now, I fault Joe Biden for being too moderate on too many issues. In this case, I think that is a reasonable position that even extreme members of the NRA and extreme supporters of the Second Amendment can agree with. Now, I referred to the polls. We have a fresh one from California, and this is a reliable poll, the PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California. I'm acquainted with Mark Baldesare, who is the pollster there. He shows a three-way tie: Warren 23, Biden 22, Sanders 21. And then the rest of the field is well back in single digits. Mayor Pete at 8%. Beto doesn't even make the cut here in California. And Tom Steyer, a California Sun, the guy who promotes impeachment and addressing climate change, he is treading water at 1%. And the worst news is for Kamala Harris. The 53% of Democratic voters say they would consider supporting someone besides her. And she is polling at only 8% as a favored candidate among likely Democratic voters in California. Encouraging news about the dropping crime rate, particularly among juveniles. Now, if you watch TV and you listen to Trump, he makes it seem like, crime is rampant and out of control everywhere in the country. But for people under the age of 18, we are experiencing the 13th straight year, reaching lows in crime levels that have not been seen in 60 years. And remember, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were talking about super predators. Right-wingers in the early 90s were writing off an entire generation of American youth. But get this. If you look at the big picture, in 2018, the arrest rate among juveniles was 21 per 1,000. That's half of what it was in the 1960s and less than one quarter of what it was in the mid-1990s. So except for TV and in the minds of certain politicians, key elements of our crime rate are declining. I want to commend The Hill, the Beltway Bible, that typically avoids issues about election integrity. And they allowed an opinion piece under the byline of Lulu Freestat to be published yesterday. The headline, "Voting machines pose a greater threat to our elections than foreign agents." Well, yes, they do. And as you may have heard me rant and rave before, I believe the election was stolen from Hillary Clinton in 2016, and I don't think any Russian fingerprints were on it. It was all done by red-blooded American Republicans. Anyway, The Hill notes that in 2010, a university cyber team conducted a test attack, and within 36 hours, the team had the ability to change votes. This was under the guidance of J. Alex Halderman, who is a professor at the University of Michigan. He offered follow-up testimony. While we were in control of these systems, we observed other attack attempts originating from computers in Iran and China. These attackers were attempting to guess the same master password that we did, and since it was only 4 characters, they would likely have soon succeeded. And security experts show that the lack of security on electronic voting machines is a significant issue. Researchers continue to discover ongoing security issues with the voting machine industry, including poor internal company security. And the two dominant companies that control 80% of the market are ES&S and Dominion Voting Systems. Bottom line is, hand-counted paper ballots, the old-fashioned way, can't be hacked, can't be manipulated. But we have these states that love to game their elections, like North Carolina. Voters and representatives pleaded with the State Board of Elections to adopt the type of voting system using hand-marked paper ballots, and they asked the board to reject ballot marking devices that use barcodes, argue that hand-marked paper ballots are more secure and less expensive. But nevertheless, the Democratic chair in this red state, Damon Circosta, reached across the aisle to join two Republican commissioners in opening the North Carolina market to a barcode ballot marking system, which we know is very much vulnerable. Similar decisions have been made in Delaware, Georgia, Kansas, New York, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Puerto Rico has been on its knees since well before Hurricane Maria. There was financial mismanagement there. At the same time, it was American brokers and bankers who kept feeding more money to debt-riddled Puerto Rico. So there's been a bankruptcy proceeding, and it appears that the vultures, led by New York right-winger Paul Singer, are taking a haircut of about one-third. The total debt is being reduced from $129 billion to about $86 billion. I don't think that's enough. I don't think that Puerto Rico, which is reeling from a loss of population, jobs, and a broken economy after the hurricane and the failed, rescue efforts, I don't know that it can handle even the remaining $86 billion. New York Times runs a piece today about Jeffrey Epstein. They dug into some financial records that they got from filings in the Virgin Islands. And there's some curious things here. He shifted from a company called Financial Trust, which is the firm that he used to milk Les Wexner, the Ohio-based billionaire, the Limited and Victoria's Secret, until Wexler cut him off. Epstein was operating a company called Financial Trust. And, for example, in 2004, it had about $500 million in assets and made $108 million in net income. But apparently, because of the Dodd-Frank law, Jeffrey Epstein traded in Financial Trust for Southern Trust, a company that he said was not a financial manager. So it didn't have to report to federal securities regulators. And he said that this new company was focused on DNA science. Now, this does not make sense, but what's fascinating here is that we get just the facts here, and the New York Times doesn't ask, where did he get this money? What is the source of his income? Was it from sexual blackmail of prominent people? Well, that is the most likely explanation, but it wasn't even raised in this latest Epstein report in the New York Times. This is a total farce and an insult to the people of San Francisco. But, Trump came out here. He didn't even enter our city. He was in Silicon Valley suburbs where he hosted a fundraiser. But that didn't stop him from becoming an expert on the homeless problem in California. And he decided, based on erroneous reports or his own delusions, that San Francisco is guilty of allowing hypodermic needles used by street people to flow into San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. And it's just totally made up. But now there's a paper trail because his buddy, the coal lobbyist turned EPA administrator, Andrew Wheeler, has issued a citation to San Francisco, a notice of violation, accusing the city of improperly discharging waste into the bay. No evidence was cited, not even Trump's crazy comments. But now there is a paper trail. I'd never heard of Dr. Joel Smithers, but he was convicted in May on 800 counts of illegally distributing opioids from a medical practice in Virginia. The authorities say Smithers prescribed more than 500,000 doses of opioids to patients from surrounding states. And to my knowledge, this is the first time a doctor has received such a serious sentence related to the opioid epidemic. And, assuming the facts are correct, I support his incarceration. Trump is continuing to try to impose new regulations related to immigration. One of the latest gambits was to declare that any immigrant who took food stamps or a housing voucher or got Medicaid would be declared a public charge, and that makes it easier to deport them. But here in Oakland, District Judge Phyllis Hamilton said the administrations have interpreted the law in an opposite way for at least the past 20 years, and that this is a non-starter. It appears she will issue an injunction to block the advance of that proposed rule. In Israel, Bibi Netanyahu is facing the music now. 10 of his lawyers attended a hearing, which is the last step where they attempt to persuade a prosecutor to drop the cases. There are 3 different cases of corruption lodged against Netanyahu. It's one of the reasons that he is so feverishly trying to hold on to his job as prime minister, because he can't be prosecuted, I guess, while he is serving. And, you look at him, at Boris Johnson, at Trump, and it is sad to see leaders across the globe under fire for corruption and bad behavior. Most of it they brought on themselves. Yesterday, I referenced the UN's responsibility for the cholera epidemic in Haiti. And in passing, I said that there have been street protests. Now we're learning that several people have died in the protests that have been going on since last weekend. And they had kind of a satirical campaign running saying, find Jovenel Moïse. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he is the current president of Haiti, installed by the United States in 2017, just another dirty deed by the Obama administration. And he is highly unpopular, and the situation in Haiti isn't going to get any better anytime soon. Meanwhile, the 51st state of Iraq is the scene of clashes, protests. The people there are demanding basic, functional government. They want reliable electricity, they want jobs, and they want to be free from violence on their streets. Security forces fired live ammunition and tear gas for the second day to try to kill those protests. I want to credit Ian Cobain, who writes for the Middle East Eye. He reported last week that Twitter's major executive, who manages the Middle East operations, has a part-time job as an officer in Britain's 77th Brigade. And that is the psychological warfare unit, the propaganda unit of the British military. His name is Gordon Macmillan. He joined Twitter at their UK office 6 years ago, and he also serves with the 77th Brigade, a unit formed in 2015 to develop non-lethal ways of waging war. So he's a cyber warrior. And, as Caitlin Johnstone points out, based on Cobain's reporting, we've seen a rash of Twitter accounts taken down, including some in the Middle East. And the mass purges are more and more exclusively targeted at governments and groups which are not in alignment with the interests of the U.S. centralized power, of which the UK is a part. We've seen mass suspensions of accounts from Cuba, China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and the Catalan independence movement, that's Barcelona. Twitter currently employs a high-level executive for whom coordinated influence operations and covert manipulative behaviors on behalf of the British government are a known vocation. I also want to recommend a piece over at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. That's fair.org, under the byline of Alan McLeod. And he does a great review of Bill Maher, the $10 million a year host of Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. And I confess that I watch the show every week, usually on my DVR when I get around to it over the weekend. And I enjoy the, back and forth. He has some good guests, but he has become a more and more alienating figure. He is arrogant, he is ignorant, and he's full of hate. Here's a guy who describes himself as an atheist, and his embrace for the politics and the state of Israel are quite remarkable. He is quite an Islamophobe, as has been quite well documented. And he trots out the New York Times editorial page editor, Bari Weiss, and gives her free rein to label many people and expressions as anti-Semitic, often undeserved. And so I bristle and I yell back at the TV set, often while I'm watching Maher on his show. I still respect him as a comic. His new rules at the end of the show can be quite provocative and interesting. But here's the guy who famously gave $1 million to Obama's campaign in 2012. And last week, it was actually September 12th, he appeared on Morning Joe and said that the Democrats' left wing, Bernie Sanders, is a cancer destroying the party, warning that the left is scarier and crazier than Trump, and nominating a leftist as his presidential candidate would spell disaster in the next election. So, Mr. McLeod here accurately concludes that Bill Maher is no liberal, he is no progressive, and he has confessed in the past that he is a libertarian. That's probably more accurate. He is the most outspoken user of marijuana on American television, and I think that fits with a lot of libertarian thought. Every day I stop to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Abby McMillan in Maine, Paul Karsh, Joe Carson in Tennessee, and Marvin Rasmussen. Can you donate $5, $10, $20 a month to keep this podcast going? I'd love it if you do. All you have to do is stop by peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. When you hit the sign-up page, you can choose a level of support that fits your budget. And if you take out a $50 annual subscription, I've got bonus books like Trump on the Couch, and I have one or two more copies of that very important book about surviving climate change called 2100. So, it's up to you. Take the next step. And as always, I like to offer the second choice. If you don't like PayPal, you can communicate with me by the U.S. mail. P.O. Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. So, as we delve into the impeachment file for today's podcast, and again, I apologize. I've kind of blown off my time limit of about half hour a day because I want to give adequate coverage. I reviewed 15 newspaper articles and watched 3 hours of television to bring you today's update on impeachment. And I want to start by framing the stark difference between the views expressed by Rachel Maddow and those by Rush Limbaugh. So, last night I saw Rachel Maddow. She was interviewed by first Stephen Colbert. I watched a show from a couple of nights ago. Then Rachel Maddow hosted her own show, and she had as her lead guest, her most prominent guest, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Now, both on her own show and on other programs, Rachel has a book out that she's promoting, and that's why she's appearing on other people's programs. Rachel is flatly stating that Trump will be impeached by the House. And, of course, she is just 1,000% invested in Adam Schiff's Ukraine angle and Nancy Pelosi's focus on Ukraine as the basis of impeachment. And Maddow goes so far to just flatly say he will be impeached. And I think that's a very risky statement to be making this early in the investigative process. Now, I'll get to Rush Limbaugh's take in a bit, but I want to just summarize it for you, that he is all in to defend the president. He uses lies, half-truths, and actual truth to make his case. And while he spins like a top, Rush Limbaugh has devastating impact when he talks about Adam Schiff. And he's got Adam Schiff's number, so we'll get to that in a bit. All right, so last night, Rachel Maddow decided that this was the time to promote Hillary Clinton's new book that she co-authored with her daughter, Chelsea. And so Hillary got about 30 minutes, which is a very long time, to be a guest on Rachel Maddow's show. And I cannot describe to you the irony, the contradiction that I experienced in hearing Hillary Clinton being allowed to go on television and talk about the lack of transparency exhibited by Donald Trump. And this is the woman who, as Secretary of State, took a meeting with the Crown Prince of Bahrain a day after he had donated $1 million to the Clinton Foundation, and this last-minute meeting had been jammed onto her schedule. And not only did Hillary Clinton take the meeting, she delivered for the Crown Prince and changed American policy toward Bahrain in the middle of the Arab Spring. And she has gone to great lengths to obscure that. Her role in the takedown of the government in Honduras in 2009 and the cover-up of the activities where we kept the deposed president out of the country long enough to install the guy we liked. And then there is Haiti, where she and her husband Bill did a triple play. All right? She's the Secretary of State. He's running the Clinton Foundation, which had a special project for Haiti. Plus, he was named a UN something or other for the reconstruction of Haiti. And they went in there in full crony mode. And all of this has been obscured. Then, of course, we have the battle over her Wall Street speeches, which Bernie Sanders singed her for in the 2016 campaign, and WikiLeaks finally published in the fall of 2016. So listen to the Queen of Transparency, Hillary Clinton, as she tells Rachel Maddow what's wrong with Donald Trump.
There was nothing classified. There was nothing that should have been kept from the rest of the government. This was embarrassing and potentially impeachable because of the way the president was pressuring the president of Ukraine. And, of course, there can be very serious calls that never see the light of day until 30, 40 years from now. But this was not one of those. This was hidden by the White House lawyers because somebody in that room who was observing the call or hearing the president's end of the call went, oh, what are we going to do? Mm-hmm.
Now, there's an opportunity here to ask a raft of questions, like Secretary Clinton, there's no of in there, sorry. Were you aware that at any time while you were Secretary of State, that records of phone calls or other meetings with foreign leaders were handled in a similar way? Did you ever advise that certain reports or documents be secreted on this top-secret server? I'd love to hear the answer to that, but the question doesn't even occur to Rachel Maddow as she is lobbing marshmallows at the former and failed presidential candidate. And by the way, speaking of that transcript, I'm glad to see that the Washington Post is reporting today questions about the validity of the memo of the phone call that was released by the Trump White House. Now, I have from the get-go suspected that the document we saw does not reflect a 30-minute phone call. That's what we were told the length of the call was. And, as I noted from the first time I read it, there are areas where they put in ellipses, 3 dots. Now, that is typically an indication that something was left out. And there are several passages that feature ellipses, 3 of them, in the alleged memo of the conversation that has been released. And my first reaction to it was, this is Bill Barr's handiwork. Just like he did with the Mueller report, where he sat on the full report for a month after putting out his misleading summary of the report. Well, Senator Angus King, the independent of Maine, had a couple of interns read the call summary aloud. And using a stopwatch, they came up with about 11 minutes, 10 minutes and 40 seconds. Then they got out a calculator. They went into words per minute. And I won't bore you with the details, but basically the call with Zelensky showed both of them talking at about 65 words per minute, when in a call with the Australian Prime Minister, they were at a rate of 133 words per minute. And in a case where Trump and the president of Mexico both spoke through interpreters, they still managed to achieve a rate of 102 words per minute. So I strongly suspect that this is a doctored document, and that could be one of the elements that surfaces if there is a real investigation. Now, today, Trump startled many people by blurting out that not only was it appropriate for him to ask Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, that he now wants China to start an investigation into the Bidens. And I have to say that I've only recently seen any reporting on Hunter Biden's activities in China, and none of it suggests that he has profited in any significant way. He did take a ride on Air Force Two with Daddy to China, and he came back with some sort of a business arrangement. But if his assertions can be believed, and if the reporting we've seen so far is accurate, the China story is a non-starter. Now, as you know, I still think that the appearance of a conflict of interest, the appearance of nepotism, is very powerful both in this China introduction and in relation to the Ukraine. Now, also note that Nancy Pelosi has gone on trips to China, where her child, Paul Pelosi Jr., has tagged along. And I know Paul a little bit, and he is a serial investor type. He's always got some new investment option or operation going on. And I don't know if Paul Pelosi has actually profited from his mother's introductions to Chinese leaders. But I will say that I have the same perception of nepotism and conflict of interest of that as I do of Hunter Biden. So Trump just seems to be digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And this is on the heels of yesterday's most bizarre performance. And we pity the president of Finland, Sauli Niinisto. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Mr. President. But he had to endure not one but two encounters between Trump and the media, where he was just a prop, just a potted plant there with a little Finnish flag on his lapel. And Trump was really, really out of control. He was sputtering and spewing epithets, slamming the media, Adam Schiff, Shifty Shift, Shifty Shifty. And it was just so embarrassing. As an American, I feel a need to address my entire audience in Finland. Do I have any listeners in Finland? If I do, would you please email me and confirm that? I mean, I know I have listeners in Denmark and Norway, but I don't believe I've ever heard from someone in Finland. So if you live in Finland and you listen, email Peter at peterbcollins.com. You'll make my day. So anyway, if you saw any part of this, it's even more cringeworthy than what Larry David does. And Larry David is acting. I'm not the biggest fan of Frank Bruni. He's a journeyman reporter who's become an opinion columnist at the New York Times. He spent time as a restaurant reviewer, a movie critic, but he also covered Capitol Hill during Bill Clinton's impeachment. And I recommend his column dated October 1. If Trump goes down, he's taking everyone with him. And Bruni makes a strong comparison between the way Bill Clinton responded to his impeachment over sex and perjury with Trump's reaction so far. Clinton never publicly accused his detractors of treason or floated the idea that one of them be arrested on those grounds, as Trump did with Schiff. While Hillary talked about a vast right-wing conspiracy, none of those people were persecuted or punished. And they didn't insist, as Trump and his defenders routinely do, that a vital part of the federal government was an evil cabal intent on undermining our democratic processes. The Clintons possessed and projected a moral arrogance that was laughably oxymoronic under the circumstances, and they and other prominent Democrats junked the party's supposed concern for women's empowerment to savage Monica Lewinsky, Paula Jones, and others who came forward with the claims about Bill Clinton and his sexual proclivities. But they didn't equate the potential fall of the president with the fall of the republic. They didn't go full apocalypse. Well, Bruni goes on for another page and a half, and I won't quote all of it to you, but follow the link in the show file and check it out. It is an interesting look at both impeachment processes. Also at the Times, in a news column under the byline of Maggie Haberman and Annie Carney, they note that Trump is a one-man band in responding to this challenge presented by impeachment in the House. And he's feverishly tweeting from 6 in the morning until late at night. And he hasn't set up a war room the way Bill Clinton did, essentially to separate the impeachment from the ordinary business of the administration. And he routinely shows his insecurity as he tries to demonstrate maximum strength, and it ain't working. The Washington Post put the fact-checkers on Mike Pompeo's dissembling responses and his ultimate admission this week that he was actually listening in on that July 25th call between Trump and Zelensky. And I have linked to this so you can read it for yourselves. I think it's interesting, and they do show that Pompeo knew about the call and lied about it. But he's a clever son of a bitch who is slippery in the way he lies. So when asked about whether Rudy Giuliani should be talking to Ukrainian officials, Pompeo says, well, you're asking me to comment on an IG report I haven't seen and some reporting. I have no idea if it has any foundation whatsoever. Well, he was on the call. So to make that last statement, no idea if that has any foundation whatsoever, well, it is a dodge. It is dissembling. Is it a flat-out lie? In this case, yes. So I think that is also worth taking a look at. Now I want to get to Adam Schiff and Rush Limbaugh's comments on his radio program today. Because, as I said, Limbaugh employs lies, half-truths, twisted characterizations, and he is so loyal to Trump that he will say anything, do anything to protect his guy. But both Limbaugh and Trump have seized on an admission that was published in the New York Times, and curiously, the story that I printed out here from the Times about the information that the CIA whistleblower who filed this complaint about the Ukraine phone call contacted the intelligence community before he filed his complaint. Now, this is being construed by Rush and Donnie as evidence that Schiff was in on this from the start, and Trump even went so far as to accuse Schiff of writing the whistleblower's complaint. And Limbaugh echoes that without quite fully embracing it. Now, from what we understand, the whistleblower did make contact with a committee staffer who advised him to lawyer up and to file a complaint with the Inspector General. That appears to be standard operating procedure, and I don't have any particular criticism of Adam Schiff for that. But as I mentioned, the New York Times has given credit for breaking this story, but the account I have is written by the Associated Press but published by the New York Times. That's pretty rare. They usually only publish their own reporters' stories. So I don't know if that means anything. But I will say that aside from his lies and his efforts to push the meme that Adam Schiff wrote the whistleblower complaint, Limbaugh demonstrates that he knows that Adam Schiff lied a lot about Russiagate, claimed to have evidence, claimed to have anonymous sources, and he has never produced them. And while Adam Schiff is not as annoying as that Republican guy who ran the Benghazi investigation, oh gosh, I usually can summon his name, and right now it's just a blank. Gowdy. Yeah. Clay Gowdy? His name's Gowdy. He's out of Congress now. But he was the annoying guy who just kept bringing the Benghazi hearings over and over again. And I don't think Schiff is as annoying as Gowdy, but I think that he is as unreliable. And Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats have made a huge bet on Adam Schiff in the current impeachment moment. Now, this one's a wobbler. It's not directly related to impeachment, but it's about Trump, and it's a head-scratcher. Did he really talk about digging a moat at the border? Well, he denies that, and it appears he doesn't know the word moat because he tweeted it as moot without putting quotes around it. But leaks to the New York Times that Trump has blamed on the Washington Post, get your facts straight, Donnie, suggests that he talked about a moat. He wanted to stock it with crocodiles and alligators. He wanted to issue bayonets to the troops that he had deployed to the border who are forbidden by law to enforce immigration standards and arrest people. He suggested that those soldiers could open fire on migrants, but only wanted them to shoot the immigrants in their legs. And so this is just more bizarre stuff that he denies as fake news. But I believe at least some of it. I don't think that it is all concocted. Yesterday we mentioned that the Trump administration was being pressured by a federal judge to voluntarily agree to preserve all records related to the impeachment inquiry and the phone call records that are in dispute. And the administration agreed they will voluntarily do that rather than allowing the judge to order them to do so. I can't quite sort all this out, but I'll share it with you. There is a disconnect between the Prime Minister of Australia, whose name is Scott Morrison, and his U.S. Ambassador Joe Hockey. And it relates to Trump's efforts to squeeze Australia to cough up information about their former diplomat who was the ambassador to the United Kingdom, Alexander Downer. And, you know, Downer was one of the people who reported to the U.S. that Papadopoulos was blathering about getting dirt from the Russians in the form of Hillary Clinton emails. So the Prime Minister is saying that while he has agreed to cooperate with the inquiry, that's the Trump inquiry, the Bill Barr investigation into the Mueller investigation, he has indicated that they're unlikely to provide Downer's diplomatic communications. It would be a very unusual thing to do, and Australia would never do anything that would prejudice our national interest, according to Morrison. But his ambassador is still making noises that Australia wants to cooperate, will cooperate. Hockey wrote to Bill Barr, while Australia's former High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Alexander Downer, is no longer employed by the government, we stand ready to provide you with all the relevant information to support your inquiries. We'll see how that one sorts out down under. I was hoping that by the time my deadline approached today that we would know what kind of commentary Kurt Volker made to the combined committees. It's Intelligence, Oversight, and Foreign Affairs, I think, who were meeting in a closed session in the Capitol today. Volker resigned as the special envoy to Ukraine. He had agreed to set up meetings between Rudy Giuliani and an aide to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And he was intent, having been appointed by Rex Tillerson and being he's a protege of John McCain. He was trying to, in his view, stand up for Ukraine. But I regard this as a spin that was put out in advance of his testimony to try to make him be a warmer and fuzzier figure. And finally today, I want to recommend a piece by Trevor Timm at The Intercept. He notes that this impeachment scandal and the arguments over the classification of the Ukrainian phone call record, that we just have too much that is kept secret. We are overclassified. And this is a growing, festering problem, and I'm glad he has called attention to it. We make far too much secret, and then we trip over ourselves trying to manage all that, trying to keep in line the people who know the secrets and keep it from people who aren't supposed to know the secrets. And so take a look at this. I think it's a very important call to action that is long overdue. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the dang place, including in Australia and in Finland. I can't wait to hear from you in Finland. So let's all hop on trigger and ride off into the sunset. You'll find this podcast on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.